Last week, we started a study through the book of Judges, and we saw that it gets its name from the men that God raised up to rescue Israel from their enemies. Of course, they were only in trouble because they were disobedient in the first place. They had this cycle where they disobeyed God, and God handed them over to judgment to their enemies, and they would cry out, and God had compassion on them, and so he would send these judges, these deliverers and saviors to them. And they would walk with God again for a while after that, but it wasn't very long before they were right back in trouble. And so God sent another judge, and the cycle just continued all the time. And they were prone to wander like this from the very beginning. Before Moses even got down the mountain with the covenant, they were already abandoning Yahweh, saying, here, these are the gods here that rescued us out of Egypt. They complained and rebelled all through the desert. In fact, the first generation wasn't even allowed to go into the promised land because of it. We saw last week, failed to drive out all of the enemies in the promised land. So after all that God had done for them with the plagues and with the Red Sea and with Jordan River and all those miracles, they failed. They failed over and over, and they proved that they weren't going to get any better. And when all of them, in the first chapter there of Judges, when all of them failed to drive out the inhabitants, and instead they enslaved them or had mercy on them or whatever, God said, I will not drive them out before you. That's chapter 2, verse 3. But they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And that caused people to weep, and they offered sacrifices, and I imagine for a little while they were back on track, but it wasn't long before they fell away again. And that is the point of really the whole book, but the whole point of the rest of chapter 2 as well. Let's go to verse 6. Judges chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua dismissed the people, so we're going back in time here again. Okay, this is two separate. The first part of it was how Israel fared throughout their history to that point, and then it goes back from a little different perspective here. Right after that time, when Joshua dismissed the people, each went to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And they served the Lord, they served Yahweh, all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived him, who had seen all the great work that he had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance. Verse 10. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know Yahweh or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in his sight and served the Baals, false gods, local gods. And they abandoned Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked Yahweh to anger. They abandoned him and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, his hand was against them, just as he had warned and as he had sworn. And they were in terrible distress. Then he raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, their fathers who had obeyed the commandments of Yahweh, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, he was with the judge. And he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, for he was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I have commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. He does this in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Chapter 3, now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. Verse 4 now. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the inhabitants. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Pretty sad story, isn't it? Doesn't take any time at all. And if you'll recall back to Joshua chapter 24, in his farewell address, he said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions and sins. If you forsake him and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And the people, if you remember, what they say to Joshua? No, but we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said, your witnesses against yourselves in what you've said. And they said, that's right, we're witnesses against ourselves. And so what Judges is here, what I just read in chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 3, is a short summary since that time. They said, no, we can do it. Well, okay, how'd they do? And that's the point here. That's what the author is trying to get across and to show us how quickly that prediction came true. He says, you can't do it. And they say, oh, we can do it. We know we can do it. So he dismisses them. They go home. And one generation later, they were living like pagans. Within one generation, they were serving false gods. And it's strange how quickly it happened, and it's even stranger considering the commandment that they were given. You remember in Deuteronomy, Moses gave them a commandment. This is Deuteronomy 11. I'll just read 18 to 21. He says, you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. Now I want you to think about this. How did they in one generation lose their entire religion when this was one of the laws that they had to follow? You shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you're sitting in your house and when you're walking by the way, and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that your days may be multiplied, that the days of your children may be multiplied in this land, as long as the heavens are above the earth. Here's this great promise. You're going to stay here forever. You just have to keep this part of the covenant. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to write it down everywhere. I want you to talk about it all the time. Don't let this slip away from your children. And one generation later, they had already completely forsaken him. You would think that they would at least have a little bit of time in there, right? I mean, some time for corruption. That's kind of like what we see in the New Testament church. They didn't just abandon the faith. It was just false teachers crept in. And now you have all kinds of crazy doctrines, but it took a long time. They didn't have time for that. They didn't even wait for the corruption. There's not even a need for trickery or false doctrine. These people drop it while it's still fresh. They don't need to wait. That's because there is a problem with their hearts. When we read those Old Testament stories and we learn about the Israelites, and when we see the story of the judges, what we are examining here is a heart problem in a large group of people. A group of people who are singled out to follow God and give Him promises, but they can't do it. He said there at the end of the chapter 3, verse 4, at the end of what we read, that God had left some enemies in the land for the testing of Israel to know whether they would obey. I'm leaving a few enemies in this land to do a test. And the test isn't to see how much they know. It's not like a test to see if you can pass. It's more like an X-ray test to see what's inside. When the doctors are doing that, they already kind of have an idea of what they're doing, right? They're just looking so they can see exactly what it is. That's what God was doing with Israel. I want to show you my point. As Paul would write later, there is none righteous. Well, how does he know? Well, because there had been a test run on these people that were singled out and given all these privileges and given all these promises. And he says, look, there was none. Not even one of them. Israel was tested to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord. So they lived among the inhabitants. Israel was tested to know whether they would obey the commandments. There was a procedure to find out what was in their hearts. So their daughters they took to themselves for wives. Israel was tested, so they gave their own daughters to the pagan sons, and they were tested, so they served those other gods. The test was done, so Israel was found guilty. Like a doctor might say, we did the x-ray, so we found the broken bone. Israel had religion, but they had no heart. They had no heart for it. Zechariah makes that very clear in his prophecy. This is from Zechariah 7:12. He says, they made their hearts diamond hard, lest they should hear the law and the words of God. They made their own hearts so hard, they didn't want to hear. They didn't want to obey. I want you to go over to Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 23, and I want to show you what he prophesied when he saw their need. Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 23. The Lord speaking through him says, I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations. And then verse 24, I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. So here's this promise of Israel to Israel that is a new covenant promise. It's given during the old covenant, but it's looking forward to the new. He says there's going to be a time when this that you see doesn't exist anymore. I'm going to change it. I'm going to bring you back to the land. I, look at verse 25, will sprinkle clean water on you. And you shall be clean from your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart. And a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I'm going to take that hard heart from you. I'm going to take that inability from you, and I'm going to give you a soft heart. I'm going to empower you Verse 27, I will put my spirit within you. I will cause you. Look at that word. I will cause you. I will be the driving force behind your power. I will be the one who makes this happen. I will cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. Ezekiel comes way later than Joshua and Judges. There's a lot of history. And Ezekiel could look back and he could say, man, this is Israel during the time of the Judges with their cycles. It's failure after failure after failure. But a time is coming when God says that He will change that. He will remove that heart of stone and give a heart of flesh. He will put the Spirit within His people and cause them to walk according to His statutes. Something they could never do on their own. And then verse 28, you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God, and I will deliver you from all your uncleannesses, and I will summon the grain and make it abundant and lay no famine upon you. You see, Israel had every opportunity to get it right, but they failed miserably. God says it's all about His own reputation. He says, my name is profaned. Brought you into this good land and you can't live for me. You can't keep it up. So I'm going to do it all. They got themselves kicked out of that land. How does that make God look? Is God effectual? Can he change a person's heart? And the pagans who knew that He got them out of Egypt, and the pagans who saw the victories that they had, how they laughed when God's people couldn't even stay in the land. What kind of God is that? He says, my name is profaned. My name is blasphemed among the heathen because of you. So I'm not going to let you do that. You can't. I am going to take the lead. He will do the job Himself. He will vindicate His own name. He will cleanse His people. He will give them a new heart and give them the Spirit. He will cause obedience. He, if you notice the very end of that section, He will secure the promised blessing. I will give you this land. I've been trying to do it now for generations. There won't be any curse. There won't be any famine. But it's because I'm going to be the one who delivers this righteousness to you. This has a lot to do with the gospel today, does it not? Do you see how relevant this is to the message that we believe and the message that we preach? It tells us a lot about, I'm going to say, spiritual resolutions. About this mindset of getting set and pushing through. This mindset of being disciplined as a believer. Is there a New Testament command to walk in the Spirit and in obedience? Sure. There are lots of commands in the New Testament, are there not? He says, do this. Do it like this. Don't be like this. But doesn't it also say, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling? Why? Look at that, Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, since it is God who works in you, both to will and to do for His good pleasure. Think about what that means for a second. Think about how this is for us in relation to Israel. Here's Israel in the time of the judges, and God says, do this or die. How'd that work out? And when people died, how'd it work out? When he did miracles, how'd it work out? Did it ever get better? Shake your head, yes or no. Did it ever get better for Israel? It didn't. No matter how many miracles, no matter how many opportunities, no matter how many leaders, none of that could change them because their hearts were hard. The writer of Hebrews says that they all perished in the wilderness because they had no what? No faith. They could not enter into the promised land because they had no faith. Their hearts were hard. They did not believe. And so they rebelled. And every chance they got, every time Yahweh gave them an easy, comfortable life, they began to go astray. What about in the New Testament times? Are we different? Are we different as humans than the Israelites? As Paul would ask, are we better? No. No. We are still all as spiritually depraved and wicked as any one of them ever was. The difference is, Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because God is at work in you. What is he doing? He is giving you the will and the ability to obey. Two things Israel didn't have. Never at the same time, anyway. They never had the will and the ability. Maybe they got the will, and man, they would press through and they would look good and religious. But they didn't have the ability to keep it, not for one generation. They abandoned him immediately. God is working in you to make you willing and able to obey him. That's not something you can resolve to do. No number of spiritual disciplines is going to help with that. The whole idea of spiritual disciplines, it's kind of it's like those commands. There are things you can find and you can say, okay, I'm supposed to do this. Yeah, but you have to see it within the context of Old Testament versus New Testament. Yes, there are commands. No, you can't keep them except by faith. It's not something you can resolve to do. For it to happen, here's the thing. You have to be born again. Right? You have to be born again. As Jesus told Nicodemus, John 3:5, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he what? He cannot see, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. And does that not go right along with Ezekiel's prophecy, with his words of people being sprinkled with clean water? He says, I will sprinkle you with this water. I will cleanse you of your uncleanness. I will give you my Spirit. Jesus comes along later. He says, you got to be born again, Nicodemus. Well, what does that mean? Nicodemus, think about Ezekiel. Think about Ezekiel. What's he say? You got to be born of the water and the Spirit. You got to be cleansed of your uncleanness. You have to have the Spirit of God, or you're never going to reach your goal. You have to have a new heart, Nicodemus. And it's sad and frustrating when you hear these preachers or teachers or leaders quoting Old Testament verses without some kind of New Testament context. And I'm not saying in this that no one in the Old Testament understood anything, but everything they understood was by faith. And the thing is that we now have the New Testament. And so when we try to take the verses out of the Old Testament, here in Judges, we cannot do it without a New Testament context. You have to understand this. There are people who will look at someone and tell them, they'll stand up in the pulpit and they'll say, choose this day whom you will serve. And all the power of that person's spiritual life going forward hinges on that decision. Someone will say, choose this day. And that person right there is left to commit himself by sheer will, by force, to decide, I'm going to make this decision. As if people today had more spiritual strength than the people of Israel did. And then when that person goes and he starts to question his salvation, what do they tell him? They say, well, you need to go back to that moment when you made that choice. You need to drive a stake right there and you need to trust in that. But can you not see that the focus in that scenario is more on man than it is on God? In fact, it's entirely on man. You made this decision. You stick to that decision. Listen though, that verse in Joshua, choose this day whom you will serve, is not a verse that's supposed to give us hope. You hear that? That verse is not there to give you hope. It's there to make you hopeless if you try any other way than Christ. Choose this day. Go ahead, choose. You're going to fail. What Joshua say? You are not able to serve the Lord. For He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive. There's no hope in that. But read it alongside John 15:16. Jesus speaking to His disciples, He says, you did not choose me, but I chose you. I appointed you that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should abide. Now that verse is talking specifically about the disciples, but Luke tells us there was a time when they were preaching the gospel and the Gentiles heard the good news. They began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord. And listen to this, as many as were appointed, what happened? As many as were appointed to eternal life believed. Listen to this, our hope is not in our ability or desire to choose Christ. Our hope is in that Christ has chosen us. And that's not some secondary ivory tower doctrine for the elite. That is the most primary doctrine that we have. And when we see it that way, it's not about us doubling down and making an effort. It's about us trusting in His promise, and that's all. So when people question their salvation, we don't refer them back to their decision. But instead we point to Christ and we say something like, He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. We remind them that Christ is the founder and perfecter of our faith. He is the champion who initiates and perfects it. All of our hope is in Him. All of our attention is on Him. Same thing goes for, I'm just randomly pulling out some verses that get used from the Old Testament. Verses like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And these are great verses. And they are worthy of memorization. But they aren't methods for salvation. They're not a way to get close to God. Let Israel be an example. It is impossible. It is impossible But if we interpret these verses in light of the context of the New Testament, we see